It is my distinct honor to welcome to this pulpit and to this preaching moment our own Joan Deming. I just wanted to, many of you know Joan. When Joan and Don became a part of this community, it was a great gift, but it felt like they had been here all along. Became a part of how we live in this world, in this corner of the Twin Cities. But more important than that, Joan, who is a United Methodist pastor, retired, although I often forget to put the retired piece in there, has been not only a welcome gift to this community, but also has been a font of wisdom and teaching for me personally. I have just enjoyed learning at Joan's feet about so much that I have neither seen and witnessed as she has, but also how it is to be a minister internationally. That has been a great gift to us. Many of you may know that Joan was the one who was preparing us for a trip to Israel. And for a year, we had the privilege of learning from Joan and being introduced to a lot of her relationships and friendships in Palestine. And of course, after the October 7th Hamas attacks, that trip had to be canceled. But Joan has not stopped. She has continued to travel and continue to advocate and continue to do the work of peace. And so, yes, we are very blessed with her wisdom, but what I want you to know, too, that wisdom is born of a deep love and compassion for God's people. And that preaches, that means her whole life and her entire work is a sermon. And so I am so happy to have our own Joan Deming come and bring the word to us. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you. Thursday evening this week, Don and Anna and I got to hear Sweet Honey in the Rock at the Dakota Club. I've loved Sweet Honey since I first heard them at a clergy women's consultation, and I think about 1979. Their very first song Thursday night began, "Somebody prayed for me, had me on their mind, took the time to pray for me." And within a minute, they had all of us singing with them. Well, I'm so glad they prayed. Yes, I am glad they prayed. I'm so glad they prayed for me. Well, this week I have felt prayed for, as I've seen many of you or heard from you, looking forward to this morning. And so I thank you and invite you to pray with me now. Gracious God, open our hearts and minds to receive your blessing. Make of us a renewed and re-energized people, able to let the light of your love shine through our lives so that others will be blessed as well. In Jesus' name, amen. The parable I chose for this morning's reading is one of my favorites. I've often heard it reflected on in my visits to Palestine and religious circles there. It's from Luke chapter 18, verses 1 through 8, part of a series of Jesus' teachings about the meaning of faithfulness, about how to be faithful. And I'm reading today from the Good News translation. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to teach them that they should always pray and never become discouraged. In a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. And there was a widow in that same town who kept coming to him and pleading for her rights. saying, "Help me against my opponent." For a long time, the judge refused to act. But at last he said to himself, "Even though I don't fear God or respect people, yet because of all the trouble this widow is giving me, I will see to it that she gets her rights. If I don't, she'll keep on coming and will wear me out." And Jesus continued, "Listen to what that corrupt judge said. Now will God not judge in favor of God's own people who cry to him day and night for help? Will God be slow to help them? I tell you, God will judge in their favor and do it quickly. But will the Son of Man find faith on earth when he comes?" Well, as Joan mentioned, in October of 2023, 25 of us from Plymouth Church were prepared to go to Israel, Palestine, to begin a 2-week pilgrimage. We planned to visit holy sites and meet local peacemakers, including Jewish and Muslim friends, but mainly meeting Palestinian Christians. We spent months preparing, learning about the current situation, even meeting by Zoom with people that we expected to meet in person. And then October 7th happened. That horrific attack from Gaza Hamas fighters upon local communities of Israeli Jews near Gaza and a music festival where carnage resulted. As Israel and the rest of Palestine reeled, it was soon clear that we were not going to visit them. I've never been to Gaza, but I have been going to Israel and the West Bank since 2008. Sometimes 2 or 3 times a year. I've led close to 20 groups of pilgrims similar to the group that we were going to take from Plymouth. I knew, however, after October 7th, that the kind of trips I led before might never be able to happen exactly that way again. And even though I recognized that I couldn't be taking groups back, I felt drawn to go back myself, drawn to see my friends and witness how they were doing, but even more important, to let them know that in this terrible time for them, they were not forgotten. So last year, for 3 weeks in the spring, and again for 3 weeks in the fall, I flew to Israel, Palestine, specifically to visit the West Bank. Josiah Allmeyer from our church went with me on the May trip, along with a couple of others, and all of us went to volunteer on a farm near Bethlehem that I'll talk about a bit later. For those of us who had the privilege of visiting, our Palestinian friends had one clear request. "Come and see," they told us, "so you can go and tell." They are acutely aware that their story is not well known. They often feel overlooked and forgotten, and so today I'm here to tell their story and invite your care. I flew into Tel Aviv on both of my trips last year. I never got close to Gaza. Gaza overshadowed every moment of both trips, however. From the moment I got off the plane, there were large posters of the hostages being held against their will by Hamas, mainly in tunnels and elsewhere in Gaza. Hostages who are only now finally being released under a shaky ceasefire. I need to be clear as I share about Palestine that the Hamas attacks were horrifying. The hostage situation needs immediate resolution. Nothing that happened on October 7th can be condoned, but neither can the extent of Israel's relentless retaliation on more than 2 million Gazan civilians, and also on parts of the West Bank that we don't hear very much about. It seems meant to obliterate Gaza and to drive Palestinians from their homeland. More than 48,000 deaths of civilians have been recorded in hospital records in Gaza, having been killed by Israelis, using weapons paid for by my tax dollars. Nearly 15,000 Gazans are still missing, probably buried beneath tons of rubble. 70% of all the victims are women and children, including elderly. Everyone I met in Palestine called what's been happening in Gaza and also in the parts of the West Bank a genocide. We need to be open to using that term. We had private drivers pick us up at the airport and drive us directly to the West Bank, and our drivers in each of my trips talked immediately during the drive about how difficult life had become, how much harder it had become for Palestinians since October 7th. In Bethlehem, the effects of that time were immediately clear. Hotels and restaurants just were closed. They were not open whatsoever. Gift shops and holy sites were either not open or were nearly empty, because there are almost no visitors, even now, a year and a half after those days. 70% of Bethlehem's economy depends on Christian tourism, and 90% of that income stream has been cut off. Bethlehem's unemployment rate was already high at 24% before October 7th, and it has soared to 65% now. Thousands of Bethlehemites who had passes to travel from Bethlehem or from the West Bank into Israel for jobs suddenly had their passes canceled and their right to continue those jobs eliminated. Still in Bethlehem, life goes on. Children are taken to school, universities hold classes, jobs in the non-tourism sector continue, markets are open, churches and mosques continue to meet for worship, families and friends get together. There is a quiet insistence on life and dignity and steadfastness, ever steadfastness in the face of challenge. A few facts about Bethlehem might fill out the picture of what this penned-in Palestinian city has to deal with, not just since October 7th, but indeed since 1967, when Israel won the Six-Day War and conquered the West Bank and Gaza. Since then, Israel has controlled all Palestinian movement within the West Bank. Checkpoints are the most obvious means of control. 19 and 20-year-old Israeli soldiers with automatic weapons man hundreds of checkpoints inside the West Bank, not just at the borders, but between village and village and community inside the West Bank. They force green-plated Palestinian cars to stop and be inspected one at a time, often very slowly, even on roads that are for Palestinians only. There are fine highways that have been constructed for yellow-plated Israeli cars to connect Israeli settlements in the West Bank with direct access to Israel. But Palestinian cars are not allowed on those roads. The settler-only roads often force long detours that Palestinians have to take to move from one village to another. In the last month, things have gone from bad to worse. Since January 19th, think what date that might correlate with, Israel instituted a new policy of closures at checkpoints. They increased the number of checkpoints, and many of the checkpoints are closed, just flat out closed, for hours at a time, sometimes whole days at a time. Lines of cars, even thousands of cars and vehicles long, wait to go through those checkpoints if the drivers need to get from one place to another. There is no let-up in sight. Another means for Israeli leverage over Bethlehem is water, and throughout the West Bank, water is an issue. The Israeli Water Company controls how much water is allocated to buildings and to people in the West Bank, even though the aquifers that provide that water are all located beneath the West Bank. But Israel allows only an average of 66 liters of water per person per day for Palestinian use. The United Nations says that a minimum to be healthy is 100 liters per person per day. But last summer, under the restrictive policies of the very right-wing government in Israel right now, they cut the water allocation by another third, so that people were truly desperate for water during the times that I was there. Israel not only controls how much water, but when water is available. Water is turned off from the water mains, except for 1 or 2 days at a time, 2 or 3 times a month, sometimes less. And so every building in the West Bank has black water tanks on the rooftop, so that water can be collected when the water is turned on and held to be used those times that it's turned off. One more factor making life unpredictable and very scary for people in the West Bank these days are attacks from Israeli military and violent settlers. So much more could be said and probably should be said about those attacks and raids. They're violent, they're inhumane, and while they're not a new phenomenon, they have gotten exponentially worse under the right-wing government, and especially since October 7th. Protection is often given to the perpetrators of the violence, but not to those who are victims of it. My friends in the West Bank say that the tensions of constant harassment and fear have led to epidemic levels of health problems and even to domestic abuse. They say it feels like post-traumatic stress syndrome, except that it's never post. I see the emotional toll on every face when I'm there. It is the undertone in every conversation. The purpose of my trips last year was to volunteer at the Tent of Nations farm, and Jess Allmeyer from our church was on the farm with me during the spring trip. I've shared stories about this farm in a forum. Ironically, it was the day after October 7th that happened. And then also, again, I was invited to share during the Good Friday service last year. The farm is a 100-acre hilltop located just outside Bethlehem in a part of the West Bank known as Area C under the 1993 Oslo Accords, where Israel has full civil and military control or security control. Palestinians in Area C are thus especially vulnerable. The farm is owned by a Palestinian Christian family. They're Lutherans, the Nassar family. They have continually lived on and farmed their land since it was purchased by the grandfather of the current generation in 1916. So it's a more than 100-year farm. We know about those, how meaningful they are to their families. The farm sits on the only remaining hilltop south of Jerusalem that does not have a settlement on it. 5 rapidly growing settlements completely surround the farm and are home to tens of thousands of settlers. Israel wants this farm's hilltop for yet another settlement. So in 1991, they actually declared the Nassar's land to be Israeli state land. The family immediately began a legal process to contest that claim and to prove their ownership. They have all of the original documentation, the deeds, receipts from taxes paid, boundary assessments, registrations filed with previous occupiers, including Britain and Jordan. And for many years now, the Nassars have been attempting to re-register their land under Israeli law, while Israel, for their part, has been attempting to claim it for the state. It is somewhat of a miracle that 34 years later, the family is still on that land. though the farm has been attacked repeatedly, just in the last few years, apricot and olive trees have been bulldozed or burned. And this year, settlers have cut new illegal roads onto private Palestinian land immediately adjacent to the farm and even on one of the farm's fields. These are illegal under international law, but allowed by Israel. The threats to the people on the farm and to the land itself keep growing. Just in the last 2 weeks, new mobile containers have been placed immediately next to this new illegal road. And last week, streetlights were installed and turned on along that road. So there's light blaring right alongside the fence line for the farm. However, the farm is prevented from tying into the electric grid whatsoever. They have to depend on solar panels for electricity. One way the Nassars have managed to stay on their farm is by renaming it the Tent of Nations and turning it into a center for teaching both sustainable agriculture and the practice of positive nonviolent resistance. They recognize that many families in similar situations have lashed out violently at the state, they have retreated into depression, or they've simply fled. But the Nassars have chosen a different response. Their family motto, grounded in their deep Christian faith, is, "We refuse to be enemies." Up to 11,000 international visitors a year have come to the farm to meet with the family and hear their story about their decision to stay on the land and honor their family legacy. But they've also heard about the modeling of a better way of life. We would have been 25 of those thousands of people in 2023 had we been able to go. The Nassars seek to touch the common humanity in those who wish them harm. We might say here that we see them being committed to building the beloved community. I decided to go to Palestine last year after an armed Jewish settler confronted Daoud Nassar and a European volunteer on the farm in early spring last year. The settler breached the fence and accosted Daoud and this volunteer as they worked in a field. He took their IDs, he held them at gunpoint for several hours, and after scaring them nearly to death, he let them go. Daoud was asked afterwards what would have happened if the volunteer had not been with them. He replied, "I might have been arrested or held." I'm part of a Friends of Tent of Nations support group that immediately committed ourselves to trying to help recruit a constant presence of international volunteers to be with the family on the farm. Both of my trips last year were to help fill that need. I definitely worked while I was there. In the spring, I was cutting tall, really scratchy weeds and helping build a stone wall. And in the fall, I was feeding ducks and chickens, watering, fertilizing, and trimming olive trees. But the most important thing about being there was just being visible. Checking the perimeter of the farm twice a day to make sure that aggressive settlers in the nearby settlements knew that the family was not on the farm alone. While the farm is incredibly beautiful and peaceful, being there is also an exercise in watchfulness and wariness. The legal process to seek Israeli recognition of the Nassar's ownership of the land continues. Hearings in Israel's military court have dragged on for years, continually extended or postponed because the facts of the case so clearly favor the Nassars. Although the next legal steps of the process are not clear at this moment, I invite your prayers that it might finally lead to the only fair resolution possible. What keeps the Nassars and other Palestinian friends going in the face of so much discouraging treatment? There's always hope, they say. Even when nothing looks optimistic, despair is not an option. They rely on their faith, on each other, and on the care of international friends. They steadfastly continue their pleas for justice. And in their persistence, they remind me of the widow from the parable who relentlessly kept returning to the unjust judge, seeking relief from her oppressor. The judge neither feared God nor respected people, but the widow did not stop. And finally, to end her persistence, nevertheless she persisted, he gave in. The parable says, and will God not judge in favor of God's own people who cry for help day and night? Will God be slow to help them? Belief in a God who is just and compassionate keeps my Palestinian friends getting up every morning with hope. I find their witness deeply inspiring, and frankly, I've needed to remind myself to follow their model lately in relation to events in our own country. A story from Daoud captures what it looks like to hold on to the highest values, to refuse to be enemies, even in the face of something that would lead people to despair. A few years ago, Daoud tells, after working on the farm late on a Saturday evening, my children, mother, and I were returning to Bethlehem in order to go to church the following morning. It was a cold, windy night, and we were in our 1975 Volkswagen bus. Now, this is not all that many years ago, 75. As we bumped slowly along the road, Israeli commandos suddenly sprung out of nowhere in combat gear with full metal jackets, hidden faces, and automatic weapons. The officer of the patrol shouted to me to get out of the car and hand over my Palestinian ID. I could see laser beams reflected on my chest and felt the terror of that moment. After several pointed questions, the young officer told us to empty the vehicle so they could search the car. As I said, it was a very cold night, and I explained that my children were asleep and would be traumatized waking with guns pointed at them. They would have this memory for a long time, as many Palestinian children do, after experiencing similar encounters. I suggested that the windows all around the bus would enable them to investigate without disturbing my children, but the officer did not see it that way and shouted more loudly for my family to get out of the car immediately. As I bent over through the car door window, I spoke to my children in English so that the soldiers could hear what I was saying. I don't know why these words came to me, but the conversation was a game changer for what happened next. I said, "You will wake up and see soldiers with guns. You shouldn't be frightened because they seem friendly." A few minutes later, the officer called me over to return my identity card and said, "Sir, I feel we need to apologize to you. What we did was not right." My Palestinian friends continually tell me that even in the darkest times, there is hope. Hope in the resilience of the human spirit, hope in the possibility of peace, hope in the power of faith to inspire change. This is something they live with every day, and we would do well to do likewise. Amen.